Yo guys, Vision SGN here, bringing you Marvel Rivals' best competitive lineup in the game right now in Season 1, where I'll break down all 6 heroes you want to be using in comp as of right now, mainly between the ranks of Plat to Grandmaster, but for the most part, all ranks. I'll be explaining why each of the characters in the squad works well together, the reasons why I've chosen them, and what you want to be doing as each of these characters to be both effective in your role and win you games. I also want to address the adjustments to each of these heroes in this list, explaining why and when you would then change them, which is very important to understand, so let's get right into it. So first things first, just before I break down this list, I want to make it very clear that this is not a guide video for each of these heroes and their abilities, purely a breakdown of the best current roster in the game right now for comp, and on that note, let's get right into it and start with the tanks. So the first hero on the team, in my opinion, should be Doctor Strange, as I believe he's the best damage blocker in the game right now and shields your backline players extremely well. This is very important to understand, as your healers and ranged DPS players heavily rely on this and need to be well protected in order to keep both you alive, but also take down the enemy team. As the primary tank in the squad, by staying alive and playing your role as a primary tank, you will heavily influence your support players in gaining their ultimate abilities faster, which is important to do against the opponent team, and it tends to be the biggest game changer as of right now, and you'll be responsible for also mitigating incoming damage from range players, whilst also trying to isolate opponent tanks, separating them from their healers. As for the second tank, this needs to be a brawling or diving style tank, as you already have a damage blocker, and having 2 shielded slow vanguards often leads to a pacing issue on the map, and is often awkward and slow, which hinders your DPS players, as everyone then tends to stack onto the point, allowing no room for dives as they become too isolated on their own, or creates no channel for your range players, making them too easy to pick off. And for me, I think the second tank on the team needs to be a Hulk. He is an incredible diving hero with great contrast between sustain and damage output, which makes him a problem for the other team to deal with. But also, Hulk provides Strange with a Gamma Maelstrom team-up ability, which then charges Gamma Radiation and allows him to release a Gamma Energy Surge, which is slightly more powerful than his standard Maelstrom of Madness ability, but also then provides Iron Man with the same team-up, which then changes his Armor Overdrive to Gamma Overdrive, which increases his damage output significantly. And on that note, I think Iron Man is the first DPS which should be used in the squad and the third player, as he's very powerful and has a high damage per second output, and is also a hybrid hero, who's one of the best ranged and aerial heroes in the game, with great evasive abilities, which allows him to stay alive and distract the opponents, as he's very hard to isolate and kill, and he's very annoying to deal with, but also deals great splash damage and direct damage to both healers and backline players. This needs to be Iron Man's main priority when dealing constant damage to healers, which prevents them from keeping their team alive, but also delays them from keeping their ultimates. Depending on who your second DPS player is, you might then need to focus on other DPS players instead of the healers, but this will vary on who you have on your team. Seeing as you have a Hulk and another DPS who can deal with them, you then may need to change up who you are attacking from time to time. But as for the second DPS, this is where things change slightly, and the hero used can depend on various factors. Firstly, if you have a Hulk already on your team, you may need to consider the style of second DPS you need for the team. As I mentioned, this will vary on your teammates, but also the map and the mode. Now for me, Black Panther is a great diving hero and probably best to insert into this lineup, if you require diving. However, if you already have a Hulk, Hulk could either then change to a more defensive or specialist style tank, such as maybe Penny or even Groot. But then you want to consider who Iron Man teams up with, and it's probably then best to keep Hulk as he teams up well with Strange and Iron Man. Unless you want to then just have one tank, which then needs to be Strange in my opinion, as he's the best solo and primary tank in the game. But it's definitely viable, as I've proven this myself, as I'm a main tank and I also have Lord Strange, and I play in Grandmaster lobby, so I can definitely vouch for Strange being a good primary and solo tank. Now, if you decide to have one tank, Black Panther then becomes a lot more effective, as he'll be free to dive and roam and allows you to then have a third DPS player, or you can have a third support player, which is more common at the higher divisions. This player can either be a Moon Knight, who has a great team ability with Cloak and an insane DPS. However, if you feel your team lacks backline protection, i.e. the supports need protection from dive players, you may want to resort to maybe a Namor, who's extremely good at dealing with characters like Spider-Man, Iron Fist, Storm, Star-Lord and Wolverine, and this is due to the octopuses that he can place down. However, you can also then use other DPSs of course too, and this will depend on, as I mentioned, what your team needs and who you already have on the squad, but for the most part, these are the most effective tanks and DPSs you can use. Furthermore, instead of having a 2-2-2 setup, which means 2 tanks, 2 DPS and 2 supports, or a 1-3-2 setup, which has 1 tank and 3 DPS, you can then have, as I mentioned, 3 supports, which is probably the most viable setup in the game as of right now. As for who this third support is, or the fourth player on the squad in this scenario, this will vary significantly on who your other supports are and also who your DPS is. So for me, I would probably leave this decision till last, who will then become your 6th and final player in the squad. Now this will obviously depend on whether you want 3 supports, 3 DPS and 1 tank, or if you want a 2-2-2 setup. So for me, you need at least 2 supports always, no matter what. And for me, the primary healer in the game right now, the best healer in the game right now, is Cloak&Dagger. Now this is largely due to her ultimate ability, but of course she's a very versatile character with both Cloak and Dagger who can deal great damage, but also really effective healer. Now as for the 5th player and the 2nd support, this will depend on whether you want only 2 supports or 3 supports. If you're going with 3 supports, you then want this player to be a 2nd healer. Now the best 2nd healers in the game right now, in my opinion, is either Luna Snow or Invisible Woman. Now Luna Snow also has a cool team-up ability with Namor, so if that's going to be one of your DPS players because they have dives, then consider that as your secondary healer. But also, Invisible Woman's really powerful as well as a secondary healer, and because of her ultimate ability, which is really effective, and her own ability to heal herself, which is slightly better than Luna's in my opinion, this makes her the best 2nd support to use if you're going to run a 3 support setup. Now as for the 3rd and final support and 6th player in this lineup, this should be a more damage focused and support focused player, such as maybe a Rocket who can increase damage output for your team, an Adam Warlock who can revive their entire team with the ultimate ability and also has that cool soul bond ability for heals, or it should be someone like a Loki who can then mirror other players' ultimate abilities and then effectively be a 2nd Cloak or a 2nd Luna, which is really powerful, or can then use his ultimate to mirror a DPS player's ult, including the enemy team, so bear that in mind. But overall, if you're going to run a 3 support setup, make sure you have at least a primary and a secondary healer in that setup, which means Cloak will be your primary, Luna or Invis will be your secondary, and then as for your 3rd and final support and your 6th player, this will either be Loki, Rocket, Adam Warlock, or Mantis. And that, in my opinion, is the best lineup of heroes that you want to be using in competitive as of right now in Season 1. But remember, you will need to consider your team structure and whether you want 2 or 3 supports, which will then result in 1 less tank, which then means you're changing one of your DPS players, as you will either want more diving and then allows you to have a 3rd support, or you want 3 DPS players, which means you then have 2 supports. And finally, just as I was finishing up this video, it became very clear to me that I definitely need to make a 2nd video, which will then explain an alternative lineup to this current squad, using completely different characters, and explain how they can counter this current lineup and why. As always, if you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, and let me know down below if you have any changes that you would make to this current lineup. I'm VisionSGN, and I'll see you in the next one.